Just lead the charge and we'll follow your lead.
Welcome to Prepper Talk Radio. And the voice you just heard there, that's Jeff Kirkham of ReadyMan, who's our guest today. I turned on the mics and didn't let him know that we are live now. So thank you for joining us at Prepper Talk Radio here at K-Talk AM 630. And you are hearing my voice this morning instead of Scott's to kick us off, as Scott is sick this morning. So life happens to everybody, and especially to us today. Our guest was also meant to be John from survival-medical.com. Go check out their website. And but he has to deal with a forest fire up at his neck of the woods and on their family's ranch, having to move cattle. And man, life happens, doesn't it, Jeff?
Life happens, yeah. Imagine that. The irony of we're talking about first aid today, and people are sick and out fighting fires and doing the good deed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true. And I know that with me and my family, life happens. And Scott was telling me some things that are happening with his family. Man, we just don't escape it, do we? I mean, it happens to everybody. And we appreciate you joining us this morning and listening to our banter. This is the way I like to kick it off, rather than just jumping right into the subject. But we'll just jump right in. Like Jeff said, we're going to talk about first aid. Kind of a boring subject. Hopefully we won't make it terribly boring. And maybe it's boring because you haven't learned from the right people, right?
Mm-hmm. First aid's one of those. It's really boring until you're faced with it, and then it's absolutely terrifying.
Absolutely, that's a great comment. And let me kick it off. And I think I've mentioned this experience of mine before. When I was about 17, I was doing a lot of rock climbing up AF Canyon. Had just come off the wall and heading down the canyon, and we had heard some brakes screeching and a crash. And so we jumped in my truck and headed down the canyon, and didn't see anything, turned around, and the next thing I saw was a guy staggering on the side of the road. It looked like he was drunk, but he was obviously injured. And he's bleeding, and, I'm 17. I have no idea what I'm doing. We pull over, and these guys were obviously drunk and had crashed their truck off the road. One guy had gone through the windshield, was sitting on top of the engine block. The hood was gone.
Holy cow.
And the other guy had gotten out and was staggering down the road, obviously trying to find help or something. And I stood there, and I was in shock myself. I had no idea where to even start at that situation. And my call out to all you callers is, you listeners, is to call in with an experience similar to that. And so that gave me the motivation to go get my EMT certification. So a few years later, after that, I still had the deep desire to know more about what to do in a situation like that. And so I went and got my EMT certification, and it's still, that knowledge still lingers with me today. Now, so that's where my level of expertise comes from today, and talking to you about first aid and first response, first responders is the term. What about you, Jeff?
I started out, in ReadyMan, first aid and initial response, or first respond is a big part of what we teach, because it's one of those things of it's responsibility. If you're going to, most of our folks out there are firearms enthusiasts, and so we like to say, hey, if you're gonna carry firearms, you need two ways for trauma. You need one to cause trauma, which is your firearm, and then you better have a first aid kit with you, or an IFAC, individual first aid kit with you, so that you can help that trauma. And that's just good responsibility. So when I started down the path, I actually, in the Army, in Special Forces, we get quite a bit of first aid training, and it's been interesting to watch the first aid training over the years has changed. From, I joined in the 80s, late 80s, and then just retired here a couple years back. And it was really interesting how the war has changed a lot of stuff. So my training was, I got my civilian EMT certification, and then, of course, the Boy Scouts before that. Right. And then I got my EMT certification again when I was in the Army. So I was nationally certified and Utah certified, and then went through pretty heavy trauma training through the Army itself. Which ultimately is interesting to see how things have changed now. The protocols have changed now. We're smarter now than we were then, I think. And really the biggie is we used to make things incredibly complicated, and the reality is there's no reason for it to be that complicated. And we really ended up simplifying a lot of stuff. And so it's nothing to really be that scared of, especially if you're a first responder out on a car wreck or like what you're saying, mountain climbing or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we've spoken before, with your tourniquet, things have dramatically changed in that realm as to how to treat patients, how to treat victims, as well as CPR.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, the old myths about the tourniquet, for the folks that are listening that don't know, I'm the owner and I'm the inventor of the RATS tourniquet, the Rapid Application Tourniquet System. And I developed that based off of stress. When you're scared in the dark, your fingers don't work so well, and so I was tired of the one we were being issued, and so in a burst of ultimate ego, I was like, well, I'm going to make something better. And about 4 years later, but the old myths with tourniquets have finally subsided, and actually some of my biggest customers are police officers. And as a matter of fact, we just had a save last week in New York City. We had an NYPD officer was responding to a gal that got hit by a train of all things. And
I saw your Facebook post on that.
Took her, she ended up losing her leg, but the responding officers were there with the RATS and were able to put it on there. But
awesome.
Those old myths about if you use a tourniquet you're going to lose the limb and all this stuff, nothing could be further from the truth. There's zero. That's an old urban myth that keeps coming from the Civil War. It's absolutely not true.
Okay, we've got a caller here in line 3, and it says it's me. So let's see who this is. Hang on, let me push the right button here. And yes, go ahead.
I have two questions for you. One, so as far as medical and evolution on first aid and things like that, I've got an old British SAS survival book. I mean, is that something that I need to kind of update, or is that something that should be able to get us by if something were to go wrong or we find ourselves in a situation?
You familiar with that, Jeff?
Yeah, if you get on there, the latest stuff that I'd go over, and there's a plethora of information that are out on the internet, but if you look at the current, if you're talking about trauma, which if you're talking about your SAS book, it's probably pretty close to that. If you're talking about trauma, you want to go to TCCC or TCCC, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, and look at what their guidelines are, their latest guidelines. Anything that's current, just look at the date on it, 2015-14. Will be a great reference for you. Beyond that, if you're talking basic first aid, if that's what's in the book, your basic first aid really hasn't changed when you start talking like splints and pressure dressings and,
Controlling
and stuff
bleeding
like
and
that,
so forth.
controlling the bleeding, CPR. CPR changes about every 2 or 3 years because they can't seem to make up their mind on what's right and what's not right.
Now, you aren't saying that because you're special forces and kind of have a little ego battle with British SAS, are you?
No, absolutely not. Actually, the Brits and the Americans, we actually share information quite a bit. The British were actually, if I can throw the Brits a bone, the Brits were actually ahead of us in documenting how their soldiers were dying, right down to where the bullet or the blast was on their body and what was done, and they have this huge catalog that's a wealth of information that they were actually ahead of us.
Like World War II? Or?
No, the latest conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and it's changing the way that we're looking at body armor. It's developing new body armor based off of the ratios on that stuff. So, no, actually, the Brits are probably a little bit better at putting that information together.
Great
okay,
question.
and I have
Thanks,
one
Jason.
last. Thank you. I have just one quick last question. I was raised old school in the Boy Scouts, and I was always taught that if you put a tourniquet on someone, you need to write the time, TQ, and the time on somebody's forehead for first responders. Is that still standard procedure so the first responders know how long that's been on?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the protocols with a tourniquet is you put the time on there because, depending on who you ask is how long that tourniquet can be in place. But that's ongoing, and you just let the miracle workers that are at the hospital, they can figure all that stuff out. But any information that you can give them when you're pushing them off to another to another entity helps, because one of the things that time does, it tells them based off of how long that person has been in need. So if you put on that tourniquet and it's been because of massive hemorrhage and it's been an hour, immediately the first responders know, okay, it's been an hour, we need to check on A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So actually, you're not just writing down the time of that tourniquet had been on, but if you were doing the heart rate or you're doing respirations and stuff, you would write that down as well, and then you would continue to document that. That's why in like any good first aid kit, you have a Sharpie marker, because you can write it right on the person themselves. And then if you see cascading signs that are happening, or you're seeing a decrease in heart rate or whatnot, that's invaluable information for the first responders when they come out and they're because now they know to start looking for leaks somewhere else or something else is going on.
Okay, I have one last
All right,
question.
go for
I'm going to hang up and let you answer when I'm off air. There was a controversy, and it just occurred to me as to whether or not you should put a tourniquet on for venomous snake bites or not. So if you can comment on that, that'd be great, and I'll listen to you off air. Thanks,
Jason. Appreciate it.
You know what? That's a great question. It's funny. I've been asked that twice in the last 2 weeks about venomous snake bites. And the answer is, I don't know what the current protocol is, but we'll find out for you, because that's one of those things that keeps going back and forth as well, where do you put on a constrictor band? Do you put on a tourniquet? Do you just let it go and elevate the limb, or don't elevate the limb? And so we'll find out, and we'll get back to you, because that's a great question, because we're in the middle of summer out here in Utah, and as everybody knows, we've got rattlers running around.
Yeah, that leads me to another question as well. Excuse me, on the tourniquet. I guess previous protocol was also, okay, loosen the tourniquet every so often to order to restore some flow, and then tighten it back up. Is that still a viable way to use a
depends.
tourniquet?
There's depending on who you talk to, and that's where I'd go to the latest on TCCC. At one point, they were saying put on a tourniquet, put on a pressure bandage, and then transition to a pressure bandage from the tourniquet, because you can have massive hemorrhage where you're not necessarily where you've cut the artery. So you've a leg has been shredded in a roadside blast or something like that.
So at that point, one thing that first comes to mind is, okay, use pressure points. Use at veins, arteries, and so forth. Now, would the tourniquet replace that procedure?
Yeah, see, what was happening was in the early days of the war, the old protocol was use a tourniquet on the last resort. And then what was happening was they were trying to use pressure points on guys while they were putting on pressure bandages. The problem is when you're putting on a pressure bandage, you have to wait for a little bit of time to figure out if that pressure bandage is being effective. So if you shredded an artery in, say, somebody's leg from a blast or from a gunshot wound, as a matter of fact, then what was happening was guys were continuing to bleed out. And so, and it was so much to the fact that, as an adult male on an average, you can lose 2 liters of blood. But as an adult male, if you lose 2.5 liters of blood, there's a decent chance that you will still expire. And it's later on. So there were soldiers that were making it all the way from the battlefield to Landstuhl, Germany. So they made it from the battlefield, they made it to the forward operating
bases. And not
bases,
received any blood yet.
And even if they had received some blood, and then they made it all the way to Germany, but were still expiring because the toxins, the metabolic process is still taking place in the body, and there wasn't enough volume to continue to remove those toxins in the body, and and the guys were going down into liver failure. So they were still expiring even after they made it to Germany. So that's when the protocol very quickly changed and said immediately put on tourniquets. Yeah, and then the studies that came out after that was there were literally 0 instances of loss of limb associated with use of the tourniquet. Now, if a leg or arm had been mangled in a blast, different animal. That's the tourniquet is not causing that. It was the mechanism of injury.
Right. All right, great conversation, and we will be right back after our messages from our sponsors. You're listening to Prepper Talk Radio. Thanks for joining us. And welcome back to Prepper Talk Radio. And also, we have a new website. It's ktalkmedia.com. The K-Talk News and Weather page is, I guess, always accurate and current. And so it's a great source for our weather news, and also the community calendar. Check out the community calendar page. And it's I want to remind you that this is your community. This is your calendar. You can upload nonprofit and free community events to the calendar. If you have any questions, give us a call here at the station. And thanks again for listening and coming back to Prepper Talk Radio, where we are talking about first aid. I've got Jeff Kirkham from ReadyMan with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming and filling in for both Scott and John. Otherwise, I don't know what I'd do with myself. But why don't you take a quick minute here, Jeff, and tell us real quick about ReadyMan, what you guys do.
Sure. On ReadyMan, the site is readyman.com. We're very active on Facebook. We do live feeds where we go over everything from police EDC to, I think this week we're going over EMS, EDC to, cool. And it's live feed. We do gear reviews and stuff, and quite a few videos there. And then we have the private side that's for members only. So we're online instructional training content. So we go over everything that has to do with emergency preparedness. And then we also do live training locally here in Utah as well.
And these are the guys who make the survival cards as well that you guys probably have seen at PrepperCon and of course on their websites and online as well. The lockpick card as well as the wilderness survival card and such.
Yep, one of our courses that's super popular is the kidnap avoidance hostage escape, and so escaping restraints and
that's
whatnot.
what your one card is for. The like I say, call it the lockpick card, but it's the escape and evade, or not escape and evade, but escape restraint card.
Yes.
Correct.
Yep.
Okay, cool, very cool. So we're back talking about first aid, and Jeff brought in this really cool patch. Why don't you tell me about what this ratsmedical.com, this patch you've got here?
So we just released this, as a matter of fact, and it's actually you can find it at the ReadyMan store, so readymanstore.com. And what I wanted to do is, everybody's big on these morale patches, so they've got the funny PVC patches that's got clown faces and cool commando stuff, and
politically incorrect statements.
Yeah, politically incorrect statements. So I was looking at that, and I got a couple buddies that like to put it up on the headliner of their vehicle, and because I'm constantly reminded I'm a very utilitarian type person from my business partner Evan, and so in the spirit of that, I thought, well, I'm going to do a morale patch where people can actually use it. And so what I put together was, I talked to police and actually quite a bit dispatchers that when you call 911, what is the paramount information that they want? And so what I did was I came up with a list of 9 things, and this is very similar to the 9-line medevac request that we use in the military. And then so it's 9 things, and it's entitled very simply 911 request. And it just goes down the thing. So if you're scared and you're calling this in and you're not quite sure, what this is set up to do is help kind of calm you down and know what to expect for the answers that they're going to ask you. Sometimes we don't hear very well when we're under stress, so it's a visual thing as well as if you're talking to the dispatcher.
That's a great idea, and one thing I really want to talk about, and I've got a caller on hold here, and I'll get to you in just a second, but I want to talk about, when should you call 911? I mean, when's it appropriate, when to not really worry about it? But let's go ahead and take this caller. He has a question about walkie-talkies. Okay, go ahead, caller. Levi, you got a question for us?
Yes, gentlemen. For the money, what kind of walkie-talkie should I get?
That's a good question. What are you wanting to do with it? What's your purpose?
Well, hopefully you never have to do anything with it. But
okay, so you want them mainly for emergencies? Is kind of what you're.
I guess emergencies and say on the road travel.
Mm-hmm. Well, my first recommendation is get us a simple, inexpensive FRS radio, the kind you can get at Walmart or wherever. They're good for a couple of miles, and you can get more powerful ones up to 5 miles. So that would be my first recommendation. Otherwise, I would say go get your ham license.
And I think if I can throw in here too, based off of what your pocketbook looks like, a great option is the Rhino that's by Garmin, because it's a GPS and it's a radio, and you can actually ping each other and send your coordinates. We actually ended up using those about a year or so ago. We were elk hunting, and we had brought the Rhinos so that we had comms, and it turned out we got hit by a freak snowstorm, and one of our members of the hunting party got separated, and we ended up using those quite a bit, and it made a difference. So the Rhino is a great option. And then beyond that, these little small talk about radios, Motorola's obviously, I mean, they're
Better
king of the
brand.
mountain when it comes to when you're talking about radios, two-way radios. And Motorola's a great option. But these little walkabout radios, they're small enough. They're not pushing a lot of juice, so you may have to get some high ground, but they're small enough you'll actually carry them. So you're not going to, I mean, it's just not realistic to say that you're going to walk around with like a military-grade radio because they're big, heavy bricks. Who wants to carry that junk? But these little walkie-talkies or walkabouts, they're a great option as long as you can get a little bit of elevation to talk to somebody.
And and there's 20 plus stations plus all the additional security levels on there, whatever you call them.
Yep.
And so you've got a lot of options for talking, and they're very inexpensive. There's also a brand called, if I'm going to say it correctly here, Baofeng. It's a Chinese brand. They're very inexpensive, and we have some for PrepperCon, and they're only like $30 a radio, and they're about 5 watts too, so they're pretty powerful radio.
So in 5 watts, I mean, you're pushing enough juice as long as you can get a little bit of elevation. Here in Utah, we've got some terrain difficulties that come in, but definitely a good option.
But, you can also do the tin can and string thing as well. That does work.
It's a little bit short on its range, though.
Yes, you have to have a lot of string there. But thanks. Did that answer your question for you?
Oh, could I get you to spell that, Rhino?
Yeah,
Just R-I-N-O.
R-H-I-N-O.
Yeah.
Yeah, by Garmin.
Garmin,
If you go to Garmin and you look at that, that's a two-way radio that you can project out your points and see where your buddies are if you're out hunting and stuff like that.
Yeah, and most of these radios are line of sight, so they may not make it over a hill or a mountain or through a building. So just keep that in mind.
How much are those?
They're expensive, couple $100.
Yeah, they're a couple $100,
$250.
But if you're a hunter or fisher or something, I mean, it saved our bacon on that elk hunt that we were on a couple years ago. So all of a sudden, a couple $100 is not
worth
too
it.
much.
Yeah, and absolutely. Thank you very much for your call. Take care. All right, let's get back to this, your patch here, this 911 request. So essentially, the things that 911 is probably going to ask you if you call 911 for an emergency.
And it was really as interesting as when I was talking to a dispatcher, she had an interesting take on it. And, first and foremost, so I actually ended up rewriting this a couple of times because there's the information that I thought was important that I started with, and then I talked to some cops, and they went over this information they thought was important, and then I was like, well, who's taking this information? The dispatcher. So let's talk to a dispatcher and see what they say. And so, they were like, hey, first and foremost, the most important thing they need is, where are you at? Because if your phone goes dead, they know there's an emergency, and they know they need to send somebody to that point, which is not what I would have expected, but it makes a lot of sense.
That's usually their first question, isn't it? Right? I mean, they say,
where are you?
911, what's your location?
Yep. So address, landmark, mile marker, whatever that is.
So keep that fresh in your mind. Oh, when you're panicking, my husband's bleeding out or whatever. Keep in mind, okay, this is our address, so they can get there quickly.
And remember too, like you call 911, EMS overlaps with the police, and so they don't know if it's a bank robbery or they don't know if it's a car wreck or so the location, at least they'll be sending somebody if your phone goes dead. And then the next one, interesting is, are the patients still breathing? And so that tells them immediately we've got to dispatch EMTs or paramedics versus necessarily
So
sending
really
a
high
police
priority
officer.
questions come very first.
Exactly. And then how many people are injured? And so, and this is obviously is set up
Resources.
specifically for first aid, for the questions that you'd go down, not set up for if there's a bank robbery or something for police. So number of injured. So immediately they need to know, are we sending one ambulance or are we sending 3 ambulances? So they know how many to dispatch.
Fire truck and all that.
And then number 4 was describe what's going on. Describe the accident. Is it a car wreck? Is it a shooting? Is it a fire? What is it? Describe it. So now they know, because right after that is special considerations for EMS. So now they know if it's a car wreck and somebody's trapped in the car,
Or if they need to send the police.
or if they need to send the police to
Right.
secure the area, or send police and fire. Is there a fire? Is there a chemical spill? something like that. And that gets down to 6, where hazards in the area of, is it a chemical spill? Is there an ongoing fire, crime, whatnot? 7 is the method of your marking. So interestingly enough, I got in a car wreck once upon a time ago, and I thought I was very exact of where I was at, and they couldn't find me. And I was on the freeway, and they drove right past me.
So
and
method of marking, so you put out a flare.
you put out a flare, you've got your flashing lights on. Because I'd been in the wreck, I didn't have the flashing lights on, and the person who had hit me didn't have the sense to put on
I
their
assume it was
flashing lights.
at night?
It was at night,
Okay.
so it was hard to see, and the police, you watched them, the highway patrol,
They
no
go
hit
right
on
by
them,
you, and they-
went right by. It was like a 6-lane freeway under an underpass, and they didn't see it. So
Okay.
one
That's
of
a good
those
one.
blinding flashes, the obvious. Your name is a good one, because they need to know who to call back, and then your phone number and an alternate phone number is number 9. So if something happens or they can't find
They can
you,
get back,
like
yeah.
what happened to me on the wreck, they actually ended up calling me back, and they're like, "We're looking for you. Where are you?" And I'm like, "Hey, I'm under the." And they're like, "Oh, okay, we just drove past you." And they turn around and come back.
And I'll take a picture of this and put it up on our Facebook page and share that so everybody can see
Absolutely.
these items, because very important. And so leading off of this, let's talk about, when should someone call 911? I mean, we can talk about all different types of injuries, but in particular, when should someone call 911, or when should someone not call 911?
And I think and that's actually is a more difficult question than it sounds.
Yep.
But the rule of thumb is an emergency.
Mm-hmm.
If it's an emergency, you need to call 911. Now, if you've got the bleeding stopped and you can drive to the hospital because the hospital's right around the corner, it's faster for you
Yep.
getting to the hospital than it is you calling the ambulance to come and respond.
Yep.
But if you've got, like a guy like me, I'm a good-sized guy, I'm over 200 pounds. If I have a heart attack and my wife is in there, guess what she's not
gonna be
doing?
able to-
She's not dragging me over to the vehicle and putting me in the vehicle. Do you know what I mean? Call 911. And so it's 911 is one of those things where it's an emergency, and actually the dispatchers are really good at asking and ferreting out those questions from you to determine if this is a true emergency, or if they need to say, hey, get in a vehicle and just drive to the hospital.
And from my experience is that in talking with some of these dispatchers, they're very kind. They're very nice. They're more than happy to talk to you. They don't want to hear you calling because you dropped something behind the couch.
No.
Those types of stupid, silly things, which you hear about all the time online.
Yes.
People calling 911 for really bad reasons. But if you are legitimately concerned, don't hesitate to call 911.
Yep,
They
call
will be
911.
happy
That's your
to deal with
that's
you.
your tax dollars at work there. But and then just like what you said there, show responsibility. Just because you can't go to the store or something's not a reason to call 911. I mean, don't abuse it, because it's one of those things that everybody owns it, because we're all paying into the kitty for that service so that we can all help take care of each other.
And the firefighters and paramedics who will respond to your call, not only is that their job, that's what they love, that's their passion. And so they are more than happy to show up even for a false alarm, to say, that you did the right thing. If you're concerned, don't feel bad about calling us because you were legitimately concerned. We're happy to help. That's been my
and on the flip side too, we say don't call them for something that's ridiculous, but also if you're an older person and you've fallen down and you can't get up, I mean, boy, is there ever a time to call 911? I've got my uncle, my dad's cousin, so I guess that's an uncle once removed or something. He fell down. He's a former police officer. Unfortunately, he didn't have his phone on him, but he fell down outside his house and ended up passing away. He's an older gentleman. He ended up passing away because he was out exposed to the weather, all night, and so that was pneumonia and did him in. So obviously, you fall down and something like that. Boy, that's a great time to call those guys.
Yeah, and that brings into play one thing that's called mechanism of injury, which is one thing I wanted to discuss today. Is that okay? What actually happened? Was it a car wreck? Did you fall off a ladder? Did I just get a cut, or did they have a heart attack? I mean, what was it that actually happened that may necessitate you calling 911? If there was a car wreck, okay, that's probably a no-brainer. Let's call 911. If someone is sitting down and maybe has a heat exhaustion or maybe heat stroke, okay, then it's questionable. Do we call 911? Heat stroke, yes, call 911. Heat exhaustion, not necessarily. So those are a few things I wanted to talk about as we come up onto this next break. Talk a little more specifically about particular incidents or things that you would want to call 911, or what you would do in that emergency. In particular, first thing is, kind of Jeff alluded to, is scene safety. Out there on the freeway in the middle of the night, it's all dark. You don't have your flashers aren't working. That's a pretty dangerous scene. So what's the first thing we do on a scene like that to ensure our safety? I mean, other than have a flare like we mentioned.
Well, and I think that's where common sense comes into play. If you're talking about a car wreck, we want to make sure that all of our senses are aware. First and foremost, if we're stopping for a car wreck on the freeway, immediately the most important thing is don't cause another car wreck because you're stopping to render aid. Don't create another accident because you're trying to do a good thing. So we can't throw our common sense out the window. And then when you get off the freeway, you get all the way off the freeway and turn on your flashers so that other people know what's going on. So again, take care of yourself. Don't add to the problem. You want to subtract from the problem.
And here's another thing I wanted to mention is the same situation at night. If you see someone pulled over and someone has pulled over to help them, don't necessarily think, oh, I don't need to pull over and help, because you may have more resources, but also that additional light, those additional flashers are going to attract more attention and provide a little more level of safety for those people as well.
Absolutely. So the more that you're there, there may be a good citizen that pulled over, but he may not have a headlamp or a light or something like that for stuff that we should have in our EDC or everyday carry for our vehicles.
Absolutely. And here comes our music, and we will see you after the break again. Prepper Talk Radio, thank you very much for joining us. All right, coming back from break, you're listening to Prepper Talk Radio here on K-Talk AM 630. And we were briefly talking about scene safety. And my final comment I wanted to make on that is don't put yourself in danger just to try and help out. And that's really what this means by scene safety is, yes, we want to try and help, but if it risks our own lives, it's probably not worth that effort. So make sure your scene is safe, whether it's...
And I think what you mean, just to clarify, is by risking our lives, we end up risking other people's lives. So like all of a sudden there's a car wreck and we slam on the brakes to help a car wreck on the other side of the freeway, and we end up causing a 5-car pile up on our side of the freeway. You haven't done any good. You've caused problems.
You made it worse.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's transition to. We wanted to talk a little bit about shock, about trauma, about different recovery positions. When you come up on a scene, you have to do a little bit of triage. If there's more than one person who's injured. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about triage and how you determine. I mean, this obviously takes some practice, and that's where medical professional comes in. How can we simply and basically triage individuals to say, okay, this person's more important at this particular moment than another?
And position has changed quite a bit over the last 20 years. It used to be that they were in neutral C-spine alignment. They were laying on their back. You did the chin lift, jaw thrust position. And now that's changed. And let me caveat that with it's not changed if you're dealing with a cervical injury. That hasn't changed.
Again, look at the mechanism of injury.
You have to look at the mechanism of injury. So in the military, we started out, back in the day, everybody ended up like that, and we were ingrained in that. And actually, there's a video that I show in some of my classes where there's a medic working on a guy who stepped on a landmine in Afghanistan, and he's so caught up on this guy's got to lay on his back that he's literally kneeling on the guy's chest to keep him to lay on his back so that he can work on his leg, which, I mean, obviously that's not the preferred method. And so now what we're seeing with trauma, remember C-spine is we've that's the exception of the rule. We're seeing now that we're actually letting the patient dictate to us. And typically what we're seeing and where we're moving people is on their side with their head on their arm, kind of like how probably a lot of you guys sleep out there. Because if the patient is in a relaxed position, then all of a sudden life has just gotten easier. It allows them to relax a little bit, talk to us, give us the information. A lot of information that you find out about an injury, the person is telling you where it hurts, what happened, and all of that stuff. If they're fighting you because they can't breathe based off of their positional alignment, or, you know, in the old days we used to say if a gunshot wound to the chest, you would lay them on the gunshot side. Now, I don't know how many of you guys
pressure on that to keep it from bleeding.
Well, actually, it was so that the lung that was bleeding would pool on the bottom, and it wouldn't affect the good lung, with your two lungs. Well, I don't know about you, but if you've ever had a broken rib, guess which side you're not laying on?
Yeah.
You're not laying on that side.
Now, there are a standard protocol, I guess you would call them, for the shock position, recovery position, that I think everybody needs to know. And like you're saying, you don't necessarily force someone to take that position, but if you're guiding them and as a first responder, providing that aid and that level of comfort, when you step in and you have some knowledge and you're acting calmly and you're speaking calmly and asking questions and helping that individual, it's going to provide some comfort to them in their injured state.
Yeah, the Trendelenburg position is the one that you're talking about, or the T-Berg position, or the shock position, where the feet are slightly elevated over the heart.
Laying on their back. You would lay someone on their back.
Laying on their back. You could do this in the rescue position too if the person's on their side, because gravity still works that way. It's no problem. And then all that's doing is helping with the blood volume so that the heart has a little bit more blood volume that can help push around.
So let's discuss exactly what shock is, because I think it's a very generalized term, and I think more of us need to recognize what shock is, or be better at recognizing what shock is and how to treat it.
Actually, technically speaking, if you die, or when we die, we'll all die at some point. When you die, you will die of some form of shock. So whether that's septic shock, or that's hypovolemic shock, wherever, hypovolemic shock is just a fancy way of saying you bled to death. Septic shock means you got poisoned, your appendicitis, and you died of sepsis. And so on and so forth. So at some point you will die of shock.
And when someone goes in, has an injury, like a broken arm, for example, they're experiencing a lot of pain, a lot of panic, and they can tend to both, their heart rate increases and their breathing increases, and they are obviously in pain, and they're obviously not comfortable. So that truly is a state of shock right there.
That is, yep.
When your heart rate increases, say above 100 beats per minute, and their breathing is above normal, which for an adult, about 12 or 15 breaths per minute, that truly is a state of shock. So a good way to treat that individual is to lay them on their back and raise their feet, and to help calm them down.
Well, and the biggie that we have, and so without getting too technical, I mean, we're all going to die of shock and all that. But what we're generally talking about when somebody's going into shock is something that's happening based off of pain or lack of blood. Based off of pain or lack of blood. And so, and the way that we combat that is we keep them warm. That's why they say in any first aid case, you want to talk to the patient, reassure them, let them know that they're going to be okay, that help is on the way, because shock is not just a physical thing, but it's a mental thing as well. And so the more that we can calm that person down and assure them that they're going to be okay, it's not as bad as they think it is, the better off that individual is going to be. So we want to keep them warm, because typically if we're talking about blood loss, all of a sudden the body's ability to monitor its temperature, regulate its temperature, has been compromised.
And that's where your emergency blanket comes into play right there.
That's where your emergency blanket comes into play, absolutely.
And it can be easily disposed of. You're not going to worry about getting blood or body fluids on it. And it does provide a level of comfort to have someone wrapped in a blanket of sorts. But like you're saying, absolutely. You wouldn't think even in a warm temperature, warmer climate, like in the summer, well, they don't need a blanket. It's warm out here. I feel warm, so they must be warm. But that's not necessarily the case.
And we found that was happening actually in Afghanistan, where guys were getting injured, guys and gals were getting injured. due to blood loss, that all of a sudden it was like, hey, hypothermia is a very real thing. And you're talking Afghanistan in the summer, where it's 120 degrees down in southern Afghanistan. And guys were still going into hypothermia, and so that's one of the main treatments. That it's after you've plugged all the holes, you've stopped all the bleeders, you've gotten them comfortable, you've got whatever meds on board that you have to. You cover them up and get them ready for transport, because you don't want them to go into hypothermia.
Now, there's also the recovery position, which is on your side. Now, typically, when I think of this position, it's if someone has been, say, vomiting, or something like that, and they've hit their head, and so they're maybe we don't want them to swallow their vomit, so you don't want them on their back, so you can put them on their side.
Yes. Yep.
But there's also other reasons to use that
position. Those are the two positions, on your back, obviously, when we're talking about cervical, cervical spine issues, and then on the side, because generally speaking, if you lay on your back on the floor, it's not a very comfortable position. And in some cases, for some people, it's difficult to breathe. It's a little bit difficult to breathe. And so laying people on their side, I mean, you think about, again, I draw the example, most of you guys at home probably sleep on your side on the bed, because it's just a natural position it's easy and it's comfortable to lay that way.
So during a respiratory event, whether it's asthma or COPD or something like that, you wouldn't want to put someone on their back or on their side. And that's where you were saying, let them dictate what is comfortable for them, with how they can breathe, where they have less pain. Obviously, you don't want them to faint and fall and hit the ground, because they're going to cause more injury.
Just watch them and put them in that position. They'll be able to tell you just about anybody that's had a wicked case of asthma. They'll know the little tricks of the trade of where they need to be and what positions tends to help them so that they can breathe the most. And your first aid may be simply running over and getting their inhaler for them that they forgot, and getting them back. Or that's a great instance of, hey, all of a sudden I know that this person has a horrible case of asthma, and then inhaler's nowhere to be found. Boom, 911 is absolutely an option.
Exactly. And like you say, they'll know how to treat their asthma, most likely, and at what point they feel they need to call 911, or they can manage it themselves.
Yep, absolutely.
Have great points. All right, so talking a little bit more, I guess, about mechanism of injury. We're talking about your, like you're saying, the C-spine, whether your neck's been injured, your back's been injured, in what position to put them. And same with kind of breaking, if you have a broken bone or such. That's not necessarily a situation when you would move someone or move that limb, or you would kind of splint it in place. And we can talk more about that as we're coming toward the end of the show here. But that's something that's very technical that I tend to stay away from. You do need to be aware of the mechanism of injury. If it's a car wreck, most likely they're going to have a compromised spine.
They can, and it's really sobering. There's some great videos that are out on the internet where it shows people in car wrecks without their seatbelts on, and what happens. There's one that's gone viral right now. There's a guy that gets out of his handcuffs in the back of a police car, and the police car, he's being a jerk, and he's trying to light the seat on fire in front of him. Police car ends up getting in a wreck, and this guy goes out the back window during the wreck. It's like 1 second he's there, and the next second he's gone, like Houdini. So now all of a sudden, when you start talking about mechanism of injury, boy, think about the possible injuries that guy sustained. But a vehicle that's moving fast enough, I think the vehicle ended up rolling the police car. And all of a sudden he's bounced out the back window, and away he goes. And you watch some of these other videos where people get into wrecks. You don't just go forward. You end up doing like the pachinko machine inside of the vehicle there for a little bit. So
now, and most of us don't carry around seat collars, cervical collars to put around someone's neck, nor really know how to use those properly. So the best, in my opinion, best way to treat that is just to support their head, to support their neck with your hands until the professionals get there. Yeah, and you can ask people if they're like, man, my neck really hurts. Okay, that's what we call the blinding flash of the obvious of, hey, maybe something's going on here with the C-spine. Don't want to manipulate that thing around too much. If you got broken bone that's in there, it only takes one of those little pieces, a little movement that can cut some nerves, and as well, don't let the individual move their neck around. Be there to support it. Be there to hold that in place and until they can have an actual C-collar. Now, another question that came up here is about smelling salts, about ammonia, those types of things. If someone were to faint or pass out or something,
Sure.
is there any benefit of that? I mean, what's the reason for smelling salts?
Sure. Actually, that's a great question. You can use smelling salts to wake somebody up, and on the flip side, if the smelling salts are not waking them up, then this person's got an issue. It's like, whoa, if this isn't working on them, we've probably got a head injury, or we've got something else that's
more
going on
serious.
that shut down their sense of smell, which is one of the 12 cranial nerves, and one of them is smell, obviously. And so when you're going down and you're checking to make sure if this guy's got a brain injury, if they can't smell and they're not waking up and they're unconscious, boy, all of a sudden it's like this has gone really bad. It's a great time to say, hey, 911.
How about if someone's in shock? It won't necessarily pull them out of shock, but will it? If you're eliciting again a response, I guess, from that in their shock, if they're having some kind of reaction to it, you know that they are not necessarily have a more serious injury. Is that kind of also?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those. It can be an indicator, and that's when the EMS arrives. You can say, hey, I tried smelling salts on this guy and it's not working. They're out. She is out based off of whatever that mechanism of injury was, and that's a big clue to them. Say, okay, we've got a head injury, or we've got somebody that's crashing on us because of blood loss or something else.
Exactly. So when you come upon an emergency, there are certain questions and certain things that a first responder should do, and one of that first things is, obviously you look at the mechanism of injury, but then you go and say, hey, buddy, are you okay?
Yep.
I mean, these are things that you practice as an EMT and so forth. It seems
level of consciousness.
Exactly.
Yep.
And just to say, okay, what hurts? Ask the basic questions as you approach, the individual, and say, hey, my name is so and so. I'm here to help. I'm an EMT or I'm a first responder. How can I help?
Yep,
so
absolutely.
That's one of the first things.
And if they're answering you back right off the bat, you go, hey, they've got a good airway. They're conscious,
Exactly.
and if they're answering me somewhat intelligently,
gives you a lot of clues as to how
yep.
to treat this. Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for joining us. It's been a good conversation, and
my pleasure.
Thanks everybody else for listening to Prepper Talk Radio here on K Talk AM 630. And we are out of time once again, and we will see you again next week.